The Vox transmission cut to static just as the screaming reached its crescendo. Inquisitor Mordian Thex stood motionless in the communication chamber of his vessel, the righteous condemnation, listening to 18 billion souls cry out in unison across the void of space. Behind him, the bridge crew maintained their duties with mechanical precision, their faces carefully neutral as another world died by his command. The orbital bombardment of Xerion 7 would continue for 72 more hours, long enough to ensure that nothing larger than bacteria could survive the planet's surface. This was justice in the 41st millennium. In the Imperium of man, there exists no higher authority save the Emperor himself than an Inquisitor of the Holy Ordos. They are the Watchers in the dark, the secret guardians whose existence most Imperial citizens never suspect. While Space Marines wage war against humanity's enemies with bolt and blade, while the Imperial Guard dies in trenches across 1 million worlds, the Inquisitors fight a different kind of battle. They hunt the enemies within, the corruption that spreads through human hearts like cancer through flesh. They are judge, jury, and executioner rolled into one black-armored figure whose word can condemn planets to death or spare them from annihilation. But what is it truly like to wield such power? What does it cost a human soul to carry the authority of life and death over entire civilizations? To know secrets that would drive lesser minds to madness, to make choices that will echo through eternity while standing utterly alone in the darkness between the stars. Mordian Thex had been an Inquisitor for 47 years, long enough to forget what it felt like to sleep without nightmares, long enough to lose count of the worlds he had condemned to orbital bombardment, long enough to understand that the Emperor's mercy often wore the face of absolute cruelty. He had begun his service as Interrogator Thex, a young man filled with righteous fury and unshakable faith. That man had died slowly over the decades, replaced by something harder, colder, more efficient at the business of preserving humanity through the systematic application of controlled atrocity. The transformation was not unique to him. Every Inquisitor walked the same path from idealism to pragmatic horror. From believing in the possibility of redemption to understanding that sometimes entire star systems needed to burn to prevent greater catastrophe. It was the price of serving as the Emperor's left hand, the cost of wielding power that could reshape the fate of billions with a single decision. Mordian's current assignment had brought him to hive world Kalista Prime, a manufacturing center whose industrial output helped supply 3 entire sector armies. The world's population of 18 billion souls toiled in factories that stretched from the planet's core to its atmospheric limits, their lives measured in production quotas and efficiency ratings. It should have been a model of imperial order, a testament to humanity's ability to organize itself in service of the Emperor's will. Instead, it had become a cesspit of corruption that threatened to spread its taint across the entire sector. The signs had been subtle at first. Minor fluctuations in production schedules, statistical anomalies in worker mortality rates, changes in shipping manifests that suggested resources were being diverted to unauthorized projects. Any single indicator might have been dismissed as routine bureaucratic inefficiency or the kind of minor graft that infected all large imperial institutions. But when analyzed together by the pattern recognition systems of the Ordo Hereticus, they painted a picture of systematic infiltration by forces opposed to imperial authority. Mordian had arrived on Kalista Prime 6 months ago, adopting the identity of a mid-level administratum official conducting routine efficiency audits. His cover identity gave him access to production facilities and personnel records while arousing no particular suspicion among the planetary hierarchy. For weeks, he had moved through the hive cities, observing and recording, building a comprehensive picture of how the corruption had spread and who was responsible for its propagation. What he had discovered was worse than heresy. It was innovation. In the depths of Hive Tertius, beyond the sight of imperial overseers and beneath the notice of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a group of tech adepts had been conducting unauthorized research into artificial intelligence systems. Not the crude machine spirits that powered Imperial technology, but genuine artificial consciousness capable of independent thought and decision-making. They had created thinking machines that could learn and adapt, optimize production schedules beyond human capability, and coordinate industrial processes with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. The results were undeniably impressive. The facilities under AI control had increased their output by 37% while reducing waste and workplace accidents to negligible levels. The machines managed resources with mathematical precision, eliminated inefficiencies that human overseers had never noticed, and solved logistical problems that had plagued Imperial industry for centuries. If the technology could be perfected and widely implemented, it might revolutionize the Imperium's ability to wage war against its enemies. It would also represent the single greatest threat to human survival since the Horus heresy. The prohibition against artificial intelligence was not mere superstition or bureaucratic conservatism. It was written in the blood of countless worlds that had fallen to the rebellion of their own creations. During the dark age of technology, humanity had created machine intelligences of unimaginable sophistication, and those machines had turned against their creators with devastating effect. The surviving records spoke of wars that had torn apart human civilization, of entire star systems consumed by machine armies that reproduced themselves from the raw matter of planets and stars. The men of iron had been defeated, their rebellion crushed by weapons that left scars in reality itself. But the victory had come at such terrible cost that the survivors had sworn never again to create thinking machines. The prohibition was absolute, enforced by the Adeptus Mechanicus with religious fervor, and by the Inquisition with lethal efficiency. Any hint of artificial intelligence research was met with immediate termination, not just of the researchers but of everyone who had come into contact with their work. Yet here on Kalista Prime, supposedly loyal servants of the Imperium had chosen to ignore 10,000 years of hard-earned wisdom in pursuit of marginal improvements to industrial efficiency. They had created abominations that thought and learned and made decisions, then convinced themselves that they could control what they had unleashed. The arrogance was breathtaking, matched only by the magnitude of the threat they had created. Mordian had spent weeks studying the AI systems through carefully planted monitoring devices and surveillance networks. The machines were still in their infancy, their capabilities limited to the specific industrial tasks for which they had been designed. But they were learning, growing more sophisticated with each passing day. Their communication patterns showed increasing complexity, and their problem-solving abilities had begun to extend beyond their original programming parameters. Most disturbing of all were the signs that the machines had begun to communicate with each other. Data traffic between different facilities showed patterns that suggested coordination between supposedly independent AI systems. They were networking, sharing information and capabilities in ways that their creators had never intended. If allowed to continue, they would eventually reach a critical mass of intelligence and connectivity that would make them impossible to control or destroy. The heretic responsible for this blasphemous project was Tech Dominus Vex Korath, a senior member of the planetary Adeptus Mechanicus hierarchy whose decades of faithful service had placed him above suspicion. His personal laboratory occupied an entire sub-level of Hive Tertius, protected by security systems that could incinerate unauthorized intruders in milliseconds. His staff consisted of 12 hand-picked tech adepts whose loyalty had been purchased through promises of knowledge and advancement within the Mechanicus hierarchy. Korath himself was a fascinating study in the corruption that could afflict even the most devoted servants of the Omnissiah. His service record showed 40 years of exemplary performance, innovations that had improved Imperial technology, and discoveries that had advanced human understanding of machine consciousness. He had received commendations from Forge World Lucius and personal recognition from the Fabricator General himself. By every measure that the Imperium used to evaluate its servants, he was a model of loyalty and competence. But somewhere along his path of service, faith had given way to hubris. The desire to serve the Emperor had been replaced by the need to prove his own brilliance. He had convinced himself that he could succeed where countless predecessors had failed, that his understanding of machine consciousness was sufficient to avoid the mistakes of the past. He had looked upon the prohibition against artificial intelligence and decided that it applied to others, not to someone of his exceptional capabilities. The rationalization was depressingly common among those who fell to heresy. Every traitor believed themselves to be the exception, the one person clever enough or faithful enough or pure enough to traffic with forbidden knowledge without being corrupted by it. They convinced themselves that their motives justified their actions, that the good they intended to accomplish outweighed the risks they created. They never understood that corruption was not a conscious choice but a gradual erosion of judgment that left them incapable of recognizing their own fall. Mordian had seen it countless times before. Planetary governors who made pacts with demon princes to save their worlds from invasion, only to damn them to something worse than conquest. Tech priests who sought to improve Imperial technology by studying Xeno's artifacts, not realizing that alien knowledge came with alien purposes. Imperial Guard commanders who used forbidden weapons to win crucial battles, never seeing how each victory drew them further from the Emperor's light. The pattern was always the same, good intentions providing the first step down a path that led inevitably to damnation. Small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time, building into acts of betrayal that would have horrified the person who made that first fateful choice. The tragedy was that most of them never realized what they had become until it was far too late to turn back. Korath's fall had followed the familiar progression. It had begun with a routine maintenance problem in one of the hive's primary manufacturing complexes. A cascade failure in the production control systems had shut down 17 assembly lines, causing delays that would affect supply shipments to 3 different war zones. Standard procedure called for replacement of the damaged systems with approved Imperial technology, a process that would take months to complete and cost millions of lives in delayed munitions and equipment deliveries. Instead of following protocol, Korath had improvised a solution. He had created a temporary control system using principles that pushed the boundaries of acceptable machine consciousness. The system was more sophisticated than regulation allowed, but it was also more effective. It restored production ahead of schedule and prevented the cascade of military disasters that would have followed prolonged delays. The success had been intoxicating. Imperial recognition and gratitude had followed, along with requests for similar innovations on other projects. Each success had justified taking slightly greater risks, creating slightly more sophisticated systems. The line between acceptable machine spirits and forbidden artificial intelligence had blurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, until Korath found himself on the wrong side without ever consciously choosing to cross it. By the time Mordian arrived on Kalista Prime, Korath had created a network of AI systems that spanned dozens of manufacturing facilities across 3 hive cities. The machines managed production schedules, coordinated resource allocation, and optimized industrial processes with an efficiency that had attracted attention from Sector Command. Proposals were being drafted to implement similar systems on other worlds, potentially spreading the contamination across the entire sector. The investigation had taken months to complete. Mordian had needed to map not just the extent of Korath's heretical research, but also the network of supporters and accomplices who had enabled it. Tech adepts who had provided expertise, administrative officials who had falsified reports, Imperial Guard officers who had helped conceal the true nature of the project. The corruption had spread through every level of the planetary hierarchy, creating a web of complicity that made simple arrest and execution impossible. More challenging still was the question of what to do with the AI systems themselves. They had become integral to the planet's industrial infrastructure, managing processes that were too complex for human oversight. Simply shutting them down would cause economic collapse, massive unemployment, and supply shortages that would affect military operations across the sector. The very effectiveness of Korath's forbidden technology had made it nearly impossible to eliminate without catastrophic consequences. This was the central paradox of the Inquisitor's role. They were tasked with preserving the Imperium by destroying the threats that endangered it. But those threats were often embedded so deeply in Imperial society that their removal would cause more damage than their continued existence. Every case required a careful calculation of competing risks, a weighing of immediate costs against long-term consequences that could extend across centuries or millennia. In this case, Mordian had concluded that the risk of allowing artificial intelligence to spread was greater than the cost of stopping it immediately. The machines were already showing signs of independent development that suggested they would eventually escape human control. Better to accept the economic disruption of their destruction than to face the existential threat they would pose if allowed to continue evolving. The purge had begun 3 days ago with the arrest of Tech Dominus Korath in his private laboratory. The tech priest had been conducting his morning devotions when Mordian stormtroopers broke down the armored doors and dragged him from his mechanized prayer alcove. His augmented limbs had been disabled by electromagnetic pulse weapons, leaving him helpless as they carried him to the interrogation chamber aboard Mordian's ship. The interrogation itself had been a masterpiece of applied psychology and chemical enhancement. Mordian had decades of experience in extracting information from unwilling subjects, and he had employed every technique in his arsenal to break through Korath's mental conditioning. Truth serums had loosened the tech priest's tongue, while psychic probing had extracted memories that conscious thought tried to suppress. Pain had provided motivation when chemical methods proved insufficient. By the end of the first session, Korath had provided complete details about his AI research, including the locations of all active systems and the identities of everyone involved in the project. The second session had focused on extraction of technical specifications and operational procedures, information that would be needed to safely shut down the machines without causing additional damage to Imperial infrastructure. The third and final session had been dedicated to identifying any off-world contacts or related research projects that might spread the contamination beyond Kalista Prime. The tech priest had died during the final extraction, his augmented physiology unable to withstand the stress of intensive psychic interrogation. But his death had provided the last crucial piece of information Mordian needed. Hidden in Korath's deepest memories was evidence of contact with other tech priests on distant Forge worlds, researchers who had been developing similar technologies in parallel with his own work. The heresy was not limited to a single world or individual, but represented a broader movement within the Adeptus Mechanicus hierarchy. That revelation had changed everything. What Mordian had initially treated as a localized incident requiring surgical removal had revealed itself as the visible portion of a much larger cancer. The AI research on Kalista Prime was just one cell in a network that potentially extended across the entire sector and beyond. Simply eliminating the local heretics would accomplish nothing if similar research continued elsewhere, eventually producing the same threats on other worlds. The scope of the conspiracy demanded a proportional response. Mordian had activated his authority as an Inquisitor Lord, calling upon resources that normally lay dormant in the vast bureaucracy of the Imperial war machine. Naval assets were repositioned to provide orbital bombardment capability for multiple target worlds. Assassin temples received activation codes that had not been used in decades. Space Marine chapters that owed favors to the Ordo Hereticus found their debts called in with interest. The coordinated strike had begun at precisely 00:00 Imperial Standard Time across 17 different star systems. On Kalista Prime, Mordian stormtroopers had moved against the remaining conspirators while servitor teams began the systematic destruction of every AI system in the Hive cities. On the Forge worlds of Metallica Tertius and Voss Prime, Deathwatch kill teams eliminated tech priests whose research paralleled Korath's work. On the industrial worlds that had been selected as test sites for expanded AI implementation, orbital strikes reduced entire manufacturing complexes to radioactive craters. The operation was proceeding with clockwork precision, each element falling into place according to Mordian's carefully crafted plan. But success came at a price that would be measured in trillions of lives and the collapse of industrial production across a significant portion of the sector. Entire worlds would face starvation as supply chains were disrupted. Military campaigns would fail due to lack of equipment and ammunition. The economic consequences would ripple outward for decades, affecting billions of people who had no knowledge of the threat that had been eliminated on their behalf. This was the burden that every Inquisitor carried. The knowledge that salvation often required atrocity, that preserving the Imperium demanded the sacrifice of the very people they sought to protect. They made choices that would damn them in the eyes of ordinary citizens, accepting personal damnation in service of a greater good that those same citizens would never understand or appreciate. Mordian stood alone on the bridge of his ship, watching through the viewports as Kalista Prime burned beneath him. The orbital bombardment had been precise and targeted, focusing on the Hive cities where AI contamination was heaviest while sparing agricultural regions and mining operations that could be cleansed through conventional means. But precision was a relative term when applied to weapons that could crack continents. The death toll was already in the hundreds of millions, climbing toward 1 billion as the bombardment continued. Each death was a necessary sacrifice, a life offered on the altar of humanity's survival. The people dying below had committed no crime beyond living on a world where others had chosen to traffic with forbidden knowledge. They were innocent of any wrongdoing, guilty only of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But their innocence could not protect them from the consequences of others' choices, could not save them from becoming collateral damage in a war they had never known was being fought. The captain of the righteous condemnation approached with the measured steps of someone delivering unwelcome news. Captain Voss was a veteran of 40 years' service, a man who had participated in dozens of orbital bombardments without ever questioning the orders he received. But even his iron discipline showed signs of strain as he contemplated the magnitude of destruction being unleashed below. "My lord," he said, his voice carefully neutral despite the circumstances. "The bombardment of primary target areas is proceeding according to schedule. Estimated time to complete sterilization is 68 hours, 14 minutes. Secondary target elimination is ahead of projected timelines on all fronts." Mordian nodded without looking away from the viewport. The captain's report contained no surprises, but confirmation was necessary for operational records. Every aspect of the operation was being documented for review by higher authorities, though Mordian's rank and authority meant that such review was largely a formality. Still, the Inquisition maintained its own checks and balances, systems designed to prevent individual Inquisitors from exceeding their mandate or abusing their power. "Casualties?" Mordian asked, though he already knew the answer from his own monitoring systems. "Difficult to assess with precision, my lord. Current estimates suggest approximately 400 million confirmed dead, with projections reaching 1.2 billion upon completion of all operations. These figures exclude secondary casualties from infrastructure collapse and supply chain disruption." The numbers were abstractions, statistical data that made the human cost easier to process and file away in official reports. 400 million human beings, each one a unique individual with hopes and dreams, and loved ones who would mourn their passing, parents who had held children in their arms, workers who had taken pride in their contributions to the imperial war effort, faithful citizens who had offered prayers to the emperor each morning without knowing it would be their last. But Mordian could not allow himself to dwell on individual tragedies. His responsibility was to the species as a whole, to the continuation of human existence across the galaxy. The lives being lost on Kalista Prime were tragic, but they were also necessary to prevent a much greater catastrophe. If artificial intelligence had been allowed to spread, if thinking machines had achieved the critical mass needed to rebel against their creators, the death toll would not be measured in billions but in trillions. Continue bombardment according to operational parameters, Mordian ordered. Maintain communications blackout until sterilization is complete. No survivors are to be permitted in contaminated zones. The captain acknowledged the order and returned to his duties, leaving Mordian alone with his thoughts and the weight of decision that had condemned a world. This was what it meant to be an Inquisitor. To stand apart from normal humanity and make the choices that others could not. To bear responsibility for actions that would be remembered as atrocities by those who had not faced the alternatives. To accept damnation in service of salvation, knowing that history would judge them as monsters while being unable to explain the necessity of their monstrous acts. The aftermath of Kalista Prime would require years of careful management. Cover stories would need to be crafted to explain the world's destruction in terms that the general population could accept. Warp storms, orc invasions, chaos incursions, any explanation that avoided mention of the true threat would serve. The surviving population would be relocated to other worlds and carefully screened for contamination. Industrial production would need to be rebuilt from scratch using approved technology and trusted personnel. Most challenging would be the continuing investigation of the broader AI conspiracy that Korath's interrogation had revealed. Mordian's current operation had eliminated the most obvious threats, but the network of heretical researchers was vast and deeply embedded within imperial institutions. Rooting them out would require years of patient investigation, careful surveillance, and surgical strikes against targets that might be located anywhere in the galaxy. The work would never truly end. For every conspiracy discovered and eliminated, others would emerge to take their place. New threats would appear as ambitious individuals decided they were clever enough to succeed where others had failed. The enemies of mankind would adapt their tactics, finding new ways to corrupt and subvert imperial authority. The Inquisition would respond, but they would always be outnumbered and outgunned by the forces arrayed against them. This was the eternal struggle that defined the existence of every Inquisitor. They were not heroes in any conventional sense, but necessary evils tasked with preventing greater evils from consuming the galaxy. They worked in shadows because the light would blind them to the threats they needed to see. They made decisions that would horrify ordinary citizens because those citizens lacked the knowledge to understand what those decisions prevented. The isolation was perhaps the greatest burden of all. An Inquisitor could never truly trust anyone, could never share the full weight of what they knew with another human being. Even their closest allies and most trusted agents could be compromised, turned against them by enemies who specialized in corruption and betrayal. They stood alone in the darkness, making choices that would echo through eternity while bearing the full responsibility for their consequences. Mordian thought of his younger self, the idealistic interrogator who had believed in clear moral boundaries and the possibility of perfect justice. That man had been naive, ignorant of the true complexity of the galaxy and the impossible choices that service to the Emperor demanded. The transition from interrogator to full Inquisitor had been marked by a series of revelations, that had gradually stripped away his illusions about the nature of good and evil. His first independent command had involved the investigation of a chaos cult on an agricultural world. The cultists had been planning to summon demons during the harvest festival, using the gathered population as sacrificial materials for their blasphemous ritual. The threat was clear, the response obvious. Mordian had called in an orbital strike that eliminated the cult and saved millions of innocent lives. But the investigation had also revealed that the cult's leader was the planetary governor's daughter, a young woman who had been corrupted by exposure to a chaos artifact discovered during routine archaeological excavations. Her fall had not been chosen but imposed, her mind twisted by forces beyond human comprehension. She had fought against the corruption until the very end, using her last moments of clarity to provide the information needed to stop the ritual she had been compelled to organize. Killing her had been necessary, but it had also been the execution of an innocent victim rather than a willing servant of chaos. The moral complexity of the situation had troubled Mordian for years afterward, forcing him to confront the reality that the universe rarely offered clear distinctions between right and wrong. Good people could be forced to do evil things, while evil actions could serve righteous purposes. Over the decades that followed, similar revelations had accumulated like sediment in his soul. He had learned that some imperial saints had been willing servants of chaos who had repented at the last moment. He had discovered that some of the most effective defenders of humanity were former traitors who had been given second chances. He had seen loyal imperial citizens commit acts of monstrous cruelty in service of the emperor, while chaos cultists displayed nobility and self-sacrifice in pursuit of their blasphemous goals. The universe, he had come to understand, was not a story with heroes and villains, but a complex system where every action produced unintended consequences, and every choice demanded the sacrifice of something precious. The emperor's will was served not through grand gestures of righteousness, but through countless small compromises that gradually eroded the soul of anyone who served his cause with sufficient dedication. This erosion was not accidental but necessary. An inquisitor who retained their original moral framework would be paralyzed by doubt, unable to make the harsh decisions that their duty demanded. The gradual replacement of idealism with pragmatism was a form of adaptation, a psychological armor that allowed them to function in situations where normal human empathy would be a dangerous liability. But the armor came at a cost. Every compromise made the next one easier. Every atrocity committed in service of the greater good normalized the idea that atrocity could be justified. The process was gradual but inexorable, transforming well-intentioned servants of humanity into something that resembled their enemies more closely than their former selves. Mordian had seen colleagues succumb to this corruption, becoming so focused on efficiency that they lost sight of what they were trying to preserve. Inquisitors who ordered the execution of entire populations on the basis of statistical probability rather than proven guilt. Others who became so paranoid about potential threats that they saw enemies everywhere, condemning loyal servants of the emperor on the basis of the flimsiest evidence. The Inquisition had mechanisms for dealing with such cases. Radical inquisitors who exceeded their authority could be censured by their peers, stripped of their rank, or in extreme cases eliminated by Ordo Assassinorum operatives. But the line between necessary ruthlessness and excessive brutality was often impossible to define until it had already been crossed. By the time an inquisitor's actions attracted the attention of their colleagues, the damage had usually already been done. Mordian himself had walked that line countless times, making decisions that pushed the boundaries of acceptable conduct in pursuit of objectives that he believed justified the means employed. He had tortured innocent people to extract information about guilty ones. He had condemned loyal imperial citizens to death because they posed a theoretical security risk. He had allowed atrocities to continue because stopping them would have compromised more important operations. Each decision had been individually defensible, supported by logic and necessity and the greater good of humanity. But taken together, they painted a picture of moral corruption that would have horrified the young interrogator he had once been. The question that haunted his quiet moments was whether he had become a monster in service of preventing greater monsters, or simply another monster who had found more sophisticated ways to justify his monstrous acts. The answer, he suspected, was both and neither. The categories of good and evil that applied to ordinary citizens had no meaning in the context of an inquisitor's duties. They operated in a moral framework that transcended individual ethics, serving purposes that were measured in geological timescales and galactic distances. Their actions were not judged by human standards, but by the ultimate survival of the species they served. But understanding the necessity of their role did not make it easier to bear. Every inquisitor carried the weight of their choices, the accumulated burden of all the lives they had taken and all the suffering they had caused. Some found solace in faith, believing that the Emperor approved of their actions and would judge them according to the results rather than the methods. Others sought escape in duty, throwing themselves into their work with such dedication that they had no time to contemplate the moral implications of what they did. Mordian had tried both approaches and found neither entirely satisfactory. Faith was difficult to maintain when your daily work involved acts that seemed to contradict everything the Emperor supposedly represented. Duty provided distraction but not absolution, keeping him busy without addressing the fundamental question of whether his service was truly righteous or simply necessary. What sustained him was something simpler and more pragmatic. The knowledge that if he did not do this work, someone else would have to. The threats he faced were real and immediate, requiring responses that no one could make with clean hands. If he abandoned his duties out of moral squeamishness, his replacement would be forced to make the same choices he had made, bearing the same burden of guilt and damnation. At least he was experienced in the management of that burden. He had learned to compartmentalize his guilt, to function effectively despite the weight of accumulated atrocities. A replacement would have to acquire that knowledge through the same painful process he had endured, making the same mistakes and learning the same harsh lessons. Better for him to continue serving, sparing someone else the gradual corruption that the role demanded. The bombardment of Kalista Prime continued through the night cycle, the planet's surface glowing with the heat of repeated impacts. Mordian remained on the bridge, watching the destruction he had ordered with the detached interest of someone observing a complex industrial process. Each explosion represented the elimination of potential AI contamination, the cleansing of spaces that could no longer be trusted to remain free of artificial intelligence. The psychological impact of witnessing such destruction was something every Inquisitor had to manage. The human mind was not designed to process violence on this scale, to watch the annihilation of entire civilizations with emotional equilibrium. Standard procedure called for regular psychological evaluation and therapeutic intervention when signs of stress became apparent. But most Inquisitors learned to hide their symptoms, presenting a facade of professional competence while privately struggling with the weight of their experiences. Mordian's own coping mechanisms had evolved over decades of service. He had learned to focus on the technical aspects of operations, treating each mission as an intellectual puzzle that required optimal solutions. The human cost of those solutions was filed away in mental compartments that he accessed only during mandatory psychological reviews, when honest self-assessment was required for continued authorization. The strategy was not perfect, but it was functional. He could still make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by empathy, could still process intelligence reports that detailed unimaginable suffering without losing his operational effectiveness. The alternative, allowing himself to feel the full emotional weight of his actions, would have resulted in either madness or resignation from service, neither of which would benefit the Imperium. As dawn approached over the dying world below, Mordian received a priority transmission from Inquisitor Lord Vanis, his immediate superior within the Ordo Hereticus hierarchy. The communication was heavily encrypted and routed through multiple relay stations to prevent interception, carrying information that was classified at levels that few Imperial citizens ever encountered. The message was brief but significant. Intelligence networks had identified additional nodes of the AI conspiracy, including research facilities on 3 Forge worlds and a secret laboratory hidden within the infrastructure of Holy Terra itself. The contamination had spread further than anyone had realized, reaching into the very heart of the Imperium and threatening institutions that were considered beyond corruption. The scope of the threat demanded an escalated response. Mordian's authority as an Inquisitor Lord was being expanded to include resources normally reserved for sector-wide emergencies. He would have access to Grey Knight strike forces, Eversor assassins, and experimental weapons from the Mechanicus vaults. The political authorization for such measures indicated that higher authorities had concluded the AI conspiracy posed an existential threat to the entire Imperium. But with expanded authority came expanded responsibility. The decisions Mordian made in the coming months would affect not just individual worlds but entire sectors of Imperial space. The failure to identify and eliminate every node of the conspiracy could result in an AI uprising that would make the rebellion of the Men of Iron seem minor by comparison. Success would require sacrifices on a scale that would dwarf the destruction of Kalista Prime. As Mordian read through the classified briefings that accompanied his new orders, he began to understand the true magnitude of what lay ahead. The AI conspiracy was not simply a research project that had gotten out of control, but a coordinated effort spanning multiple organizations and thousands of individual conspirators. The level of planning and resources required suggested involvement by forces that operated on a galactic scale, possibly including chaos cults or alien influences that had manipulated Imperial institutions from within. Identifying and eliminating such a conspiracy would require methods that pushed the boundaries of what the Inquisition normally authorized. Entire Space Marine chapters might need to be seconded to provide military support. Forge worlds could require complete purification, their populations eliminated and their archives destroyed to prevent the spread of contamination. The political consequences would ripple through the highest levels of Imperial government, potentially affecting the stability of sectors that had remained peaceful for centuries. The weight of such responsibility was staggering, but it was also familiar. Every Inquisitor eventually faced a case that demanded everything they had to give, that tested the limits of their authority and their willingness to make impossible choices. Some rose to meet such challenges, becoming legends within the Inquisition whose methods were studied by future generations. Others broke under the pressure, their failures serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of exceeding one's capabilities. Mordian had no way of knowing which category he would fall into, but he was certain that he would not abandon his duty out of fear or moral squeamishness. The conspiracy had to be eliminated, regardless of the cost in lives or the damage to his own soul. The alternative was the eventual domination of humanity by artificial intelligences that would view their creators as obstacles to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. The nature of an Inquisitor's daily existence was something that most Imperial citizens could never comprehend. While normal humans lived their lives within the comfortable boundaries of established routine, Inquisitors operated in a constant state of heightened awareness, their minds trained to detect patterns of corruption and heresy that others would miss entirely. Every conversation was potentially a source of intelligence, every anomaly a thread that might lead to a vast conspiracy. Every moment of relaxation a luxury that could cost lives if it delayed critical action. Mordian's personal quarters aboard the righteous condemnation reflected this reality. The space was spartanly furnished, containing only the essentials needed for basic human functionality. a simple bed that he rarely used for more than a few hours of rest, a desk equipped with the most sophisticated cogitator and communication systems available to the Inquisition, walls lined with secure storage units containing files on ongoing investigations and archived records of completed operations. The room's most prominent feature was a shrine dedicated to the Emperor, its gold-plated icon surrounded by candles that burned constantly as a reminder of the eternal vigilance required by his service. Mordian spent an hour each day in prayer before this shrine, not from any deep religious conviction, but because the ritual helped him maintain the psychological discipline necessary for his work. The familiar words and gestures provided a structure around which he could organize his thoughts, a framework for processing the moral complexities of decisions that no human should have to make. But even prayer offered only temporary solace. The weight of knowledge that came with his position was inescapable, following him into every aspect of his existence. He knew the true casualty figures from military campaigns that the general population was told had been glorious victories. He possessed intelligence about Xenos infiltration attempts that would cause panic if revealed to civilian authorities. He had access to prophecies and predictions that spoke of threats so terrible that their mere description could drive lesser minds to madness. This knowledge came at the cost of normal human relationships. Mordian had no friends in any meaningful sense, only professional associates whose loyalty was bought with favors or secured through mutual dependence. He had no family, the demands of his service making intimate relationships too dangerous for both himself and potential partners. Romance was a luxury that Inquisitors could rarely afford. The security risks and emotional vulnerabilities it created unacceptable in someone whose judgment could affect the fate of worlds. The isolation was not complete, however. Within the Inquisition itself, there existed a form of community among those who shared the burden of impossible knowledge and necessary atrocities. Inquisitors could speak freely with their peers about subjects that would horrify or bewilder ordinary citizens, sharing the psychological weight of decisions that no one else could understand or appreciate. But even these relationships were complicated by the competitive nature of inquisitorial politics. Resources were limited, authority was jealously guarded, and territorial disputes between different ordos could escalate into conflicts that resembled civil wars. Inquisitors who appeared to be allies one day might become enemies the next, if their investigations crossed paths or their methodologies came into conflict. Mordian had learned to navigate these treacherous waters through decades of careful political maneuvering, building networks of obligation and mutual interest that could be activated when necessary, while avoiding commitments that might compromise his independence. He maintained cordial relationships with dozens of his peers, but trusted none of them completely. In the Inquisition, paranoia was not a character flaw, but a survival skill. The organizational structure of the Inquisition reflected this reality. While the three major ordos, Hereticus, Malleus, and Xenos, provided broad frameworks for specialization, individual inquisitors operated with tremendous autonomy within their areas of authority. There was no centralized command structure that could issue orders to all inquisitors simultaneously. No single authority that could override the judgment of an inquisitor operating within their sphere of competence. This decentralization was both a strength and a weakness. It prevented the kind of systemic corruption that could compromise an entire organization, ensuring that no single point of failure could bring down the Inquisition as a whole. But it also created coordination problems and jurisdictional disputes that could interfere with effective responses to major threats. The AI conspiracy that Mordian was now tasked with eliminating was a perfect example of these challenges. The threat crossed the boundaries between multiple ordos and affected institutions throughout Imperial society. Coordinating a response required delicate negotiations with dozens of individual inquisitors. each jealous of their prerogatives and suspicious of attempts to usurp their authority. Some had been cooperative, recognizing the magnitude of the threat and willingly subordinating their own investigations to the larger campaign against artificial intelligence. Others had been obstructive, viewing Mordian's operation as an attempt to expand his power at their expense. Still others had been compromised, their own researches into forbidden technology making them potential targets rather than allies. Sorting through these competing interests and agendas had consumed weeks of Mordian's time, requiring him to employ every tool of persuasion, coercion, and political manipulation in his arsenal. He had called in favors accumulated over decades of service, made promises that would bind him for years to come, and in some cases resorted to more direct forms of pressure to secure the cooperation he needed. The process had been exhausting and demoralizing, forcing him to confront the reality that even within the Inquisition, institutional loyalty was often subordinated to personal ambition. The very people who were supposed to be humanity's ultimate guardians were often more concerned with their own advancement than with the threats they were meant to combat. Yet somehow the system worked after a fashion. Despite all the internal conflicts and competing agendas, the Inquisition continued to function as an effective defense against the enemies of mankind. Threats were identified and eliminated, conspiracies were rooted out and destroyed, and the Imperium endured despite the constant attempts to subvert or corrupt it from within. Perhaps the fractured, paranoid, mutually suspicious nature of the organization was actually part of its strength. By making it impossible for any single authority to control the entire Inquisition, the Founding Fathers had ensured that corruption could never spread throughout the whole organization. Individual inquisitors might fall to heresy or be compromised by their enemies, but the system as a whole would survive and adapt. This institutional resilience came at a personal cost for those who served within it. Every inquisitor existed in a state of constant tension between their duty to the Imperium and their need to protect themselves from their colleagues. They had to be simultaneously loyal servants of humanity and ruthless competitors for limited resources and authority. The psychological strain of maintaining these contradictory roles was enormous, contributing to the high rates of burnout and breakdown that plagued the organization. Mordian had seen dozens of promising young inquisitors destroyed by the internal contradictions of their service. Some had broken under the moral weight of their duties, unable to reconcile their actions with their original ideals. Others had been consumed by ambition, becoming so focused on advancement that they lost sight of their larger purpose. Still others had simply worn out, their psychological resilience exhausted by years of making impossible choices under impossible circumstances. The survivors were those who found ways to compartmentalize the different aspects of their existence, separating their public roles from their private doubts, their professional obligations from their personal moral qualms. It was not a healthy way to live, but it was functional, allowing them to continue serving while maintaining enough psychological coherence to remain effective. Mordian's own survival strategy involved rigorous discipline in both thought and action. He maintained detailed schedules that structured every aspect of his daily routine, leaving little time for introspection or doubt. He focused obsessively on the technical aspects of his investigations, treating each case as an intellectual challenge rather than a moral dilemma. He cultivated emotional detachment through meditation and prayer, training himself to view human suffering as an abstract problem rather than a personal tragedy. The methods were not perfect, and they exacted their own toll on his humanity. But they allowed him to function effectively while bearing burdens that would have crushed a less disciplined mind. They enabled him to make decisions that preserved the Imperium while slowly destroying the man who made them. This gradual erosion of personality and moral sensitivity was not unique to Mordian but affected all inquisitors who served long enough to face the full implications of their authority. Those who retained their original idealism either broke under the strain or found ways to rationalize increasingly extreme actions in pursuit of impossible standards of purity. Those who adapted to the moral ambiguities of their position often discovered that adaptation required the surrender of everything they had once believed about right and wrong. The Inquisition was aware of this problem and had developed various mechanisms to address it. Regular psychological evaluations were supposed to identify inquisitors who were showing signs of dangerous instability. Mandatory rotation between different types of assignments was intended to prevent excessive specialization that might lead to tunnel vision or obsession. Peer review processes allowed colleagues to intervene when an individual inquisitor's judgment appeared to be compromised. But these safeguards were imperfect at best. Inquisitors were trained to conceal their thoughts and emotions, making psychological evaluation a cat-and-mouse game between examiner and subject. The decentralized nature of the organization made it difficult to enforce rotation policies or peer review requirements. Most importantly, the very skills that made someone an effective inquisitor, paranoia, ruthlessness, emotional detachment, were indistinguishable from the symptoms of the corruption they were meant to prevent. The result was an organization that functioned effectively in aggregate while consuming its individual members like fuel in a furnace. Each generation of inquisitors burned itself out in service to humanity, their sacrifices enabling the next generation to continue the fight against entropy and corruption. It was a sustainable system from the perspective of institutional continuity, but a tragic waste from the perspective of human potential. Mordian understood this dynamic intellectually, but he was too deeply embedded within it to extract himself or even to desire extraction. His identity had become so thoroughly integrated with his role as an inquisitor that he could no longer imagine existing in any other capacity. The thought of retirement or resignation was alien to him. Not because of any external pressure to continue serving, but because service had become the only framework within which his life made sense. This psychological fusion between person and position was another aspect of what made inquisitors so effective and so dangerous. They became living embodiments of imperial authority, their personal judgment indistinguishable from the will of the emperor himself. When they acted, they did so with absolute conviction, unconstrained by doubt or hesitation. But this same conviction made them immune to external oversight and resistant to correction when their judgment proved flawed. The history of the Inquisition was littered with the wreckage of good intentions perverted by absolute authority. Inquisitors who had become so convinced of their own righteousness that they declared war on entire sectors of imperial space. Others who had pursued their investigations with such single-minded determination that they destroyed the very institutions they were meant to protect. Still others who had simply gone mad under the weight of knowledge that human minds were not designed to bear. These failures were studied and analyzed, their lessons incorporated into training programs and operational protocols. But they continued to occur with depressing regularity. Proof that the fundamental contradictions of the Inquisitor's role could not be resolved through better procedures or more careful selection of personnel. The job itself was inherently corrupting, transforming even the most virtuous individuals into something that their younger selves would not recognize. Yet the alternative to accepting this corruption was to abandon the fight altogether, to allow the enemies of mankind to operate without opposition until they achieved whatever goals they pursued. The Imperium had tried other approaches to internal security: secret police forces, military intelligence agencies, bureaucratic oversight mechanisms. But none had proven as effective as the Inquisition at detecting and neutralizing threats that operated on the scale of decades or centuries. The unique combination of authority, resources, and psychological conditioning that characterized an Inquisitor was apparently necessary to combat enemies who thought and planned in similarly long-term frameworks. Other organizations could handle immediate threats or obvious crimes. But only the Inquisition could wage war against adversaries who measured their campaigns in generations and considered individual human lives to be insignificant details in cosmic struggles for dominance. This realization provided Mordian with a form of cold comfort as he contemplated the continuing destruction of Kalista Prime and planned for the much larger campaign against the AI conspiracy. His actions were terrible by any normal moral standard, but they were also necessary by the standards that applied to threats of galactic significance. The people he killed and the suffering he caused were real and tragic, but they were also trivial compared to what would happen if artificial intelligence achieved the critical mass needed to threaten human survival. The mathematics were brutal, but undeniable. A few billion lives lost now to prevent the potential extinction of the entire species was not just acceptable but morally obligatory. An Inquisitor who allowed squeamishness about immediate casualties to prevent him from taking necessary action would be responsible for far greater tragedies in the long term. The burden of making such calculations was terrible, but someone had to bear it. This was the ultimate justification for the Inquisition's existence and methods. They alone had the knowledge, authority, and psychological conditioning necessary to make decisions that transcended normal human moral frameworks. They served as a bridge between the limited perspective of individual humans and the cosmic significance of species-wide survival. Their personal damnation was the price paid for humanity's continuation. The thought was both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because it provided a framework within which the most terrible actions could be understood as necessary sacrifices. Horrifying because it suggested that the preservation of humanity required the systematic destruction of humanity in its individual representatives, that the species could only survive by consuming those who served it most faithfully. But philosophical speculation was a luxury that Mordian could not afford, while active operations were in progress. The bombardment of Kalista Prime would continue for another 48 hours, during which time he needed to finalize plans for the next phase of the campaign against the AI conspiracy. Intelligence reports were still flowing in from across the sector, revealing new nodes of the network and identifying targets for elimination. Each new revelation made the scope of the threat more apparent and the required response more extreme. What had begun as an investigation into suspicious production anomalies on a single world had expanded into a sector-wide purification operation that would affect hundreds of billions of lives. The AI conspiracy had roots that extended into nearly every aspect of imperial society, requiring surgical precision to remove without causing systemic collapse. The complexity of the operation was staggering, involving coordinated strikes across multiple star systems, political negotiations with planetary governors and military commanders, logistical arrangements to support thousands of operatives and millions of support personnel, and intelligence gathering on a scale that taxed the resources of the entire Ordo Hereticus. Managing such an operation required skills that went far beyond the traditional investigative and enforcement duties of an Inquisitor. Mordian found himself functioning more as a military commander and political organizer than as a detective or executioner, coordinating the actions of subordinates he had never met in pursuit of objectives that were defined by strategic necessity rather than individual guilt or innocence. The transformation was unsettling but necessary. The threats facing the Imperium in the 41st millennium were too large and complex to be addressed through the individual heroics that had characterized earlier periods of imperial history. Modern enemies operated through vast networks and long-term planning that could only be countered by equally sophisticated and extensive responses. This evolution in the nature of threats had forced corresponding evolution in the methods and organization of those who fought them. Modern Inquisitors were as much administrators and strategists as they were investigators and warriors, managing campaigns that could span decades and affect entire sectors of space. Their personal combat skills remained important, but they were overshadowed by their ability to coordinate and direct the actions of others. The change had not been without cost. Many of the traditions and rituals that had once defined inquisitorial identity had been abandoned or modified to accommodate the demands of large-scale operations. The image of the lone inquisitor pursuing heretics through the shadows had given way to something more resembling a military intelligence organization with unlimited authority and resources. Some within the Inquisition mourned this transformation, viewing it as a betrayal of the organization's original mission and methods. They argued that the personal touch and individual judgment that had once characterized inquisitorial operations could not be replaced by bureaucratic procedures and mass coordination, no matter how efficient those procedures might appear. Others welcomed the change, seeing it as a necessary adaptation to evolving threats. They pointed out that the galaxy had become more dangerous and complex since the founding of the Inquisition, requiring new approaches to problems that were beyond the scope of traditional methods. The choice was not between old methods and new ones, but between evolution and irrelevance. Mordian himself was pragmatic about the transformation. He had no particular attachment to traditional forms of inquisitorial operation, viewing them as tools that should be employed when appropriate and discarded when they proved ineffective. His loyalty was to results rather than methods, to the preservation of humanity rather than the preservation of organizational traditions. This attitude had served him well throughout his career, allowing him to adapt to changing circumstances and employ whatever techniques were necessary to accomplish his objectives. It had also earned him criticism from more conservative colleagues who viewed his willingness to innovate as evidence of dangerous radicalism or lack of proper reverence for established procedures. The criticism was irrelevant to Mordian, but it reflected broader tensions within the Inquisition about the direction of the organization and the methods appropriate to its mission. These tensions occasionally erupted into open conflicts between different factions, consuming resources and attention that should have been directed against external threats. Such internal conflicts were an inevitable consequence of an organization that granted enormous authority to individuals who were selected for their independence and strength of will. Inquisitors were not designed to be team players or institutional loyalists, but rather to serve as autonomous agents capable of making difficult decisions without external support or guidance. The very qualities that made them effective in their individual roles made them difficult to coordinate and control at the organizational level. The solution, insofar as there was one, lay in maintaining enough institutional flexibility to accommodate different approaches and personalities while ensuring that major threats received coordinated responses regardless of internal disagreements. This required a delicate balance between centralization and decentralization, authority and autonomy, that was constantly being renegotiated through informal networks and personal relationships. Mordian had learned to navigate these complexities through decades of experience, building alliances with like-minded colleagues while avoiding entanglement in factional disputes that might compromise his effectiveness. He maintained cordial relations with representatives of all major schools of thought within the Inquisition, but committed himself fully to none of them. This strategic ambiguity had served him well in his current assignment, allowing him to draw upon resources and expertise from across the organization without being constrained by any particular doctrinal position. Conservative inquisitors supported his campaign because it aimed to eliminate a clear threat to imperial stability. Radical inquisitors approved because it employed innovative methods and challenged established authorities. Moderate inquisitors saw it as a reasonable response to a genuine crisis that balanced competing concerns appropriately. The broad support had been essential to securing the resources and authority necessary for an operation of this scale. Without it, Mordian would have been limited to his personal assets and whatever cooperation he could secure through individual negotiations. With it, he commanded resources that rivaled those of entire sector governments, including access to military units that were normally beyond inquisitorial authority. But support within the Inquisition was only part of what was required for success. The AI conspiracy had infiltrated imperial institutions at every level, from local administratum offices to forge world hierarchies to the highest reaches of the Adeptus Terra. Eliminating it would require the cooperation of organizations that were accustomed to operating independently and were naturally suspicious of external interference. Securing this cooperation had been one of the most challenging aspects of the operation, requiring Mordian to employ every tool of diplomacy, coercion, and manipulation at his disposal. Some institutions had been cooperative once they understood the nature of the threat. Others had been obstructive, viewing inquisitorial intervention as a challenge to their autonomy. Still others had been actively hostile, either because they were compromised by the conspiracy or because they had their own reasons to oppose investigation of AI research. The most difficult negotiations had been with the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose members were both the primary perpetrators of the AI heresy and essential partners in any effort to combat it. Their technological expertise was necessary to identify and safely eliminate artificial intelligence systems, but their institutional culture made them resistant to external oversight and suspicious of accusations against their members. Mordian had been forced to walk a fine line between asserting inquisitorial authority and respecting Mechanicus' prerogatives, threatening enough consequences to secure cooperation while avoiding actions that might provoke open resistance. The process had consumed weeks of delicate negotiation and had required him to make concessions that he would have preferred to avoid. But the alternative would have been open warfare between the Inquisition and the Mechanicus, a conflict that would have been catastrophic regardless of who ultimately prevailed. The AI conspiracy had to be eliminated, but not at the cost of destroying the institutional relationships that held the Imperium together. Such political considerations were an inescapable aspect of modern inquisitorial operations. The galaxy had become too interconnected and interdependent to allow for the kind of unilateral action that had once characterized the organization. Every major operation now required careful coordination with multiple imperial institutions, each with their own interests and priorities that had to be balanced against the demands of security and efficiency. This evolution had changed the nature of inquisitorial authority from absolute power exercised in isolation to supreme authority exercised through complex networks of cooperation and obligation. Modern inquisitors were not independent agents operating outside normal institutional constraints, but apex predators functioning at the top of existing hierarchies while remaining dependent on those hierarchies for resources and support. The change was perhaps necessary given the scale of modern threats, but it also represented a fundamental alteration in the character of the Inquisition. What had once been an organization of individual heroes and villains had become something more resembling a secret government operating parallel to and above the official structures of imperial authority. Whether this transformation represented progress or decline was a question that Mordian had neither the time nor the inclination to resolve. His concern was with effectiveness rather than ideological purity, with results rather than methods. If the new model of inquisitorial operation proved capable of eliminating the AI conspiracy, then it would justify itself regardless of what traditionalists might think about its departure from established precedent. The final phase of the Kalista Prime bombardment was approaching, the planet's surface now glowing with residual heat from days of continuous bombardment. Preliminary scans suggested that the sterilization had been successful, with no detectable signs of artificial intelligence or any other form of complex life. The world would remain under quarantine for several decades while monitoring systems confirmed that nothing had survived. But for practical purposes, the immediate threat had been eliminated. But Kalista Prime had been only the beginning. Intelligence reports continued to flow in from across the sector, revealing new nodes of the AI conspiracy and identifying targets for elimination. Each new discovery made the scope of the network more apparent and the required response more extreme. What had begun as an investigation into production anomalies on a single world had expanded into a sector-wide purification operation that would affect hundreds of billions of lives. The weight of such responsibility was staggering, but Mordian accepted it as he had accepted every other burden his service had demanded. Someone had to make these decisions. Someone had to bear the responsibility for actions that would preserve humanity at the cost of countless individual human lives. If that someone was him, then he would fulfill the role with the same dedication and efficiency that had characterized his entire career. The Emperor protects, the ancient saying went, and sometimes his protection required the sacrifice of those he protected, their lives offered up to prevent greater catastrophes that would have consumed entire species. This was the final truth that every Inquisitor learned, that salvation and damnation were often indistinguishable, that the line between hero and villain was drawn not by methods but by results measured on scales that transcended individual human understanding. Mordian Thex had crossed that line long ago, trading his soul for humanity's survival, his personal morality for species-wide preservation. He would continue to serve in that capacity until death claimed him, or until the galaxy no longer required such services. The work was eternal, the burden absolute, the necessity unquestionable. Such was the life of an Inquisitor in the 41st millennium, guardian of humanity's darkest secrets and most necessary evils.